Tonight's topic is quite surprising. Going back a year or so, I don't think any of us would have imagined having an American Pope. As extraordinary as that is, I think the fact that the Holy Father has a tie to our town and to our university defies belief. Now, Dr. McGee has been very tight-lipped about the content of the talk tonight, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing what he's going to present, as the information will be new to all of us. Without further delay, please help me to welcome our president, Dr. Brian McGee.
Good evening. It's been my pleasure for several years to be the Colloquium speaker for the President's Honors College in the fall semester. It's the President's Honors College, so I really have to be here, don't you think? And I incredibly enjoy the experience. Over time, I've spoken on very different topics, from Cancer Alley in Louisiana to abortion and Catholic Church teaching, to free speech and events in France that called free speech commitments into question. But tonight's topic hits very close to home. So for tonight, we're going to talk about the connections that are quite fundamental to Pope Leo XIV that we have here at both Quincy and Quincy University. The title slide gives you some impression of what we're going to talk about tonight, because it shows, of course, a picture of the Holy Father the day he was named as Pope. And to its right, the most famous, and to this point, or at least until tonight, the only commonly seen picture of Pope Leo XIV's grandfather. His paternal grandfather, we're told, whose last name was not originally Prevost, but Rigatano. A mystery. And down below you see in cursive among several names in a list. This was a handwritten list of every student who was enrolled at Quincy University in a fall semester. And among those names, in longhand cursive, number 155, John Rigatano. Again, the Pope's paternal grandfather. Tonight you're going to hear an immigrant story. You're going to hear a Catholic story. You're going to hear a story that just might be about love, sex, and betrayal. And you're going to hear a mystery. That's a lot for 70, 80 minutes, but here we go. And let's add, there are big parts of this story I suspect the Pope Leo XIV does not know about his own family. I would be remiss here if I did not notice that a lot of people have contributed to what I've been able to put together tonight. There are people literally all over the world, some professional historians, far more amateur genealogists, who contributed research that I'll be sharing with you tonight. And here at home at Quincy University, it would have been impossible to put this story together without Dean Katie Kroschauer of Brenner Library, and also from Brenner Library, Lindsay Witt, whose title there is Instructional Librarian and Preservation Archivist. By the way, Lindsay is the expert on several branches of this work, so don't be surprised if you ask me a tough question if I say, Lindsay, help me out. Because, and particularly if it has anything to do with the Cento family, more on that later, it's definitely Lindsay who we should turn to. But with that, let's begin the journey. Now, I know not everybody follows things that happen in Rome carefully, even about the naming of the first American Pope. So let's give you a brief summary. Pope Leo XIV was born as Robert Prevost in 1955 in Chicago. Prevost is usually a French last name, that's important, and it's just a variation on the name or the word provost, which is an academic title. The provost, the chief academic officer of Quincy University, is here tonight. And that's a title I also held at another university. So just a variation on the theme. And a provost, or prevost in this case, is usually an academic officer at a university, is a church official, or is a jailer. So it's a term that gets a lot of use. But again, Pope Leo XIV was born as Robert Prevost. He was educated at Villanova University in Pennsylvania and at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. I believe Pope John Paul II also went to the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. Pope Leo XIV as a young man of 22, joined the Augustinians, a Catholic religious order. As a novice, he lived for a year in St. Louis. So those of you, anybody here with St. Louis connections? You can claim the Pope too. He would later serve as a missionary. He would eventually become the prior general, the top official in the world for the Order of St. Augustine, again, the Augustinians, and he served in that role for over a decade. He then became, for another long stretch, a bishop in Peru in a diocese that people objectively would say, I don't know much about that diocese. It's not like the Archdiocese of Chicago or another famous church diocese or archdiocese. But he served there and by all accounts loved it. Along the way, he kept picking up more and more and more languages. He was ultimately fluent in, of course, his birth tongue English, but also in Spanish, in French, in Italian, and with some competency in some other languages too, certainly Latin as well as German, along with some South American languages that were native to South America. But he would ultimately come to know every language his grandfather knew. More on that later. Leo was then again cardinal, Prevost, was made cardinal in 2023, and he was named Pope in May 2025. So that's a little background on the Pope, but this is a story mostly about the Pope's family, and it's that story to which I want to now turn. Because we heard quickly that he was a son of Chicago. And so, just to give you a little help on his family, he grew up in Dalton, Illinois, just south of the city border of Chicago. So he's a South Sider. That's why we learned, to my personal dismay, that he was a fan of the White Sox. Fortunately, his mother was a woman of great sense and good judgment and great faith. She was a Cubs fan, as God intended. And his mother's story is a fascinating one. Millie Martinez Prevost was ultimately a Chicagoan, but her family came from New Orleans, and her ancestry was of great interest because she was a woman of mixed race. So this Pope, this Southsider with a French name, is a man who has ancestry that is Afro-Caribbean and African-American, as well as Hispanic. And so that's a fundamentally American story about the many peoples who came in one fashion or another to the United States. We could spend a long time talking about Millie Martinez Prevost, but we're going to focus instead on the Pope's father and, more importantly, his grandparents. The Pope's father was named Louis Prevost. He was born in 1920. We'll hear a lot about that later, and he died in 1997. If you look down on the slide, to the left is an image of Louis Prevost. Now, I'm going to be straight with you. We don't have very good pictures of the Prevost family, especially of Louis Prevost. This was a bad newspaper photo that was quite blurry and granular. So thanks to the magic of GPT, this is a much better image, which I believe is reasonably accurate, of Louis Prevost, who was a World War II veteran who ultimately became a K-12 school administrator. To the right is an image of Millie Prevost with her 3 sons. The son on your left, the smallest of the 3, was the youngest, Robert. So this was a picture from the late 1950s. Now, we're going to focus on the grandfather first of the Pope Leo XIV, Giovanni Gian Rigatano. Rigatano is what kind of name? Italian. So a very Italian story that we're going to be talking about. And there are in fact 5 last names you're going to have to keep track of. So pay attention. There might be a test. 5 names. Rigatano, Cento, another Italian name, Hughes, allegedly Irish in this case, Fontaine, anyone want to guess at this one? French. And Prevost, again, usually a French name. To tell this story, we've got to go back 125 years, because that's how long ago these people lived, and it's from there that we need to march forward. And that requires a little backstory. Let's talk a bit about the United States in 1900. First of all, 1900 was the dawn of the 20th century, what was called the American century. This was a period of time when the United States grew rapidly by population and also grew rapidly in political and economic power. In the 1890s, the United States had, to much surprise in some parts of the world, easily won the Spanish-American War against Spain, a colonial power in much of the world. And the United States had itself become a colonial power as it took over lands that had been previously managed by the Spanish. Managed is an awfully polite word. The U.S. population was growing dramatically during this period. How many Americans were there in 1790 living in the United States and excluding Native Americans? Anybody having a guess? Hint, there are about 330 plus million people living in the United States today. In 1790, it was 4 million total. Not even half the size of the population of Chicago today. By 1870, it was 38 million. By 1890, it was 63 million. By 1900, 76 million, and by 1910, 92 million. In 20 years, the population of the United States grew by a third. Where was that population coming from? Immigration. Now, birth rates were high at this time, but in the end, it was a flow of immigration that was contributing to this dramatic growth. And while earlier in the 20th century, a lot of that immigration had come from Western and Northern Europe, by 1900, the immigration was increasingly coming from Southern Europe, especially Italy, and from Eastern Europe, including Russia. Between 1900 and 1910, there were 9 million immigrants who came to a country, again, that had well under 100 million. So we're talking about a rapid influx of immigration that completely changed the character and composition of the United States and ultimately created to population growth, and in some cases population strain, and created a great deal more economic power and muscle as more and more people were in the U.S. working land, working in factories, contributing to the growth of the country. Now, then as now, this immigration did not come without pushback. There was criticism of many of those immigrants. There were claims that they weren't as smart as the people who were already here, that they weren't as hardworking as the people already here, that they weren't as moral as the people who were already here, and that their religion was inferior to the religion most commonly practiced in the U.S. And what were most of these immigrants, by the way? Catholic. How many of you have heard of the Ku Klux Klan? Ku Klux Klan is famous for its anti-African American action, including horrific violence. But in the early 20th century, when the Klan became active again, much of their work and effort was directed against Catholics. And that was in no small part a response to criticism of immigrant growth. Laws were passed in 1882, 1891, and 1905, all designed to reduce immigration, and especially to reduce it from Southern Europe, Western Europe, and other parts of the world that were not Northern and Western Europe. Get it? The more Catholic you were and the less likely you were to be white, the more there was resistance to you coming. And to be clear, there was a widespread belief in some parts of the country that that Irish immigrants, including some of my ancestors, and that not a few Italian immigrants were not even white, let alone not of the right religion, because there's a huge struggle over who got to be a white person and who didn't. Lots more we can say there, but I want to give you the sense that the United States is a place where there is a lot changing quickly and where a lot of that change comes with a great deal of anxiety. And I would be remiss if I didn't note as well that the Italian immigration was a big factor. 2 million Italians came to the United States between 1900 and 1910 alone when John Rigatano came. And most of those immigrants came from the south of Italy, which was poorer and more economically challenged than the north of Italy. A few of you are nodding, so you're either students of immigration or maybe there's some family history you know. So, we have all that going, and I'll mention one other important point, and that is religious and moral beliefs in some ways are quite different 125 years ago than they are now. Let's talk about something that will be relevant in a few minutes. How easy was it to get divorced 125 years ago? I'm getting multiple very hards, and that's true. Today, universally in the US, we have something called no-fault divorce. Heard that before? And of course, many of us have family members or friends who've experienced divorce personally. But in no-fault divorce, nobody has to be at fault for the marriage ending. They just say, we can't stay married. And the process is not simple, it's very legalistic, it's time-consumptive, but no fault is required. But in the United States, the governments have always taken the position that divorce is against the American interest, that people should stay together for the benefit of their children and the benefit of one another, and that divorce is something that should only be allowed in extreme cases where there is clear fault on the part of one party. So the most common kind of fault could be adultery, someone cheated. Other kinds of fault could be cruelty. In the state of Illinois, that was a reason for divorce. Someone beat the other one. Or desertion. But divorce, other than on those three grounds, was very difficult to get, and the court often said the proof wasn't high enough even for those three things. So divorce was very difficult. But even more challenging than the legal barriers to divorce were the moral grounds. Getting divorced was considered a severe moral and personal failing. It was a sign of a personal defect and a very severe one. So if you got divorced, something was wrong with you. You must have bad character. And so there was a strong social stigma against divorce. And oh, by the way, how about having a child while not married? Now, in the United States today, it is far more common than it has ever been in the history of the country for people to have children without being married. But 125 years ago, when people still most definitely had premarital and extramarital sex, there was a strong social stigma against being married, having children out of wedlock. And so people understandably were not eager to be tarred with that reputational brush. This all becomes very important in just a few minutes. In fact, to return to divorce, it was so difficult to get in most of the United States that people started finding ingenious workarounds. So, for example, it was slightly easier to get divorced in a couple of states than in others, Nevada and Arkansas. So people would sometimes move as a couple desiring for divorce to those states, establish residency, get divorced, and then leave. That's pretty extreme. Move to a different state so you can get divorced. Even more extreme, divorce tourism that was international. By the 1920s, it was well known in America that it was pretty easy to get a divorce in France. So there was a small but constant flow of couples from the United States going to France just long enough to get divorced and leave. That's how hard divorce was. So, times were very different 125 or 100 years ago. They were I'm going to make one final point. The picture at the bottom here is the La Touraine in 1915. This was a boat that went back and forth between Europe and the United States, usually between France and New York City, with carrying mostly immigrants. It's going to carry one particular immigrant of interest to us. But before we go there, Let's talk about Quincy, Illinois. How many of you have seen old pictures of Quincy? Anybody? Several of you. Cool. Well, if you saw some of those pictures, you may know the city, first of all, was very dynamic in the 19th and 20th centuries. This was a thriving place. Of course, it had already been large enough and famous enough that it had been one of the hosts to Lincoln-Douglas debates. That was the first thing I ever knew about Quincy, other than it was when I was a kid, other than it was the place I saw the Mississippi River for the first time. The city was big enough and important enough that it had multiple presidential visits in the early 1900s. Both President McKinley and President Theodore Roosevelt visited Quincy at the turn of the century. In fact, President Theodore Roosevelt was in Quincy only about 3 months before John Rigatano arrived. In addition, Quincy was a pretty big place. Today's Quincy has 39,000 people. In 1900, it had 36,500, almost as many people, and the city was half the geographic footprint. It had some familiar names. It had Main Street. It had Broadway. It had Fifth Street. But it was a much more compact city and a much more crowded one. There were far fewer buildings and far fewer suburbs. The major industries were many. Have you heard of Knapheide truck bodies here in Quincy? They've been here for over a half century already in 1900. Gardner Denver, already here. There are many other manufacturing entities at that time. Anybody see the buggy upstairs in the library? Yeah, it's a major buggy manufacturer. That was a big deal if you needed a buggy because there weren't many cars. And of course, there are also other kinds of manufacturing entities here. Quincy was a huge builder of stoves. And since every house needs a stove, pretty handy. So it had a thriving manufacturing center. And for that matter, it was also a place that was famous for having lots of beer manufacture. Now, some of that can be traced directly to its immigrant populations because the early influences in Quincy were very, very German. In fact, if you were here in 1870, over 40% of the population was either German immigrants or descendants of German immigrants. Very German. Later on, there would be more inflows of the Irish, and especially after 1900, the Italians. Of those who were Catholic, many Germans were, certainly many Irish were, certainly many Italians were. They would tend to go to a parish that catered to their ethnicity. So the Italians in Quincy went to, anybody know which parish? St. Peter's. St. Peter's at the time was at 8th and Main. They relocated after 1945. 8th and Main is important because it's right next door to a couple of families we'll talk about. And there was also this plucky school named St. Francis Solanus College. Do you know what school that became? QU. We were St. Francis Solanus College, named after a famous Franciscan friar, until the 19-teens, and the name changed to Quincy College and Seminary. Later, it was Quincy University.
I think you can see the name right above the entry to Francis Hall.
You can, because it's there in concrete, because that was built in the 1890s. So, and QU was so German that most of the faculty, when it was started in 1860, only spoke German. In fact, it was an early struggle to teach the friars English. Here's a picture of a streetcar scene right around 1900. Streets were largely dirt. Streetcars were a big deal for transportation. There would be a few cars on the road by the middle of the decade, but it was mostly horses and buggies. Now, folks, I actually grew up with horses, and I can drive a horse and buggy. But what happens when you have hundreds and hundreds of horses in one place? A lot of manure. So let's just say Quincy, like every other city in the era, would have been a little pungent. very different place than the one we know now, and yet you'd still recognize some of the buildings. Now, been promising you that we'd be talking about the Rigatano family. They came to Quincy. And this is a story that begins with a death. A man named Vincenzo Cento and his wife Carmina had come to the United States in 1891, probably along with Vincenzo's colorful brother Sam. Is that colorful a right word? He was a character, maybe crazy. But Vincenzo was a hard worker. He built a business. Like many Italian Americans of the era, he preferred to work in a small business, or he needed to because it was hard for an Italian American immigrant to get hired in a factory. Carmina, his wife, who was glowingly given an obituary, calling her a kind and pleasant woman who everyone liked, passed away after a short illness in late 1900. This is a picture I took in St. Peter's Cemetery because her grave marker is still there in excellent condition, noting that she is Carmina, wife of Vincenzo Cento, showing her that she was a native of Italy and that she had died in 1900. Vincenzo clearly mourned the loss of his wife and was probably lonely. He had gotten his U.S. citizenship in 1900 after 9 years in the country. He applied in 1902 for a passport, and he traveled back to Italy, specifically to his hometown of Milazzo, where not that much later in April, he married a woman named Vittoria. Let's call her Victoria, and forgive me, I'm not going to try to do accents here. Victoria Rigatano, from a large family in Sicily, in April of 1903. Marrying Victoria brought a little baggage because Vincenzo soon traveled back to the United States, also by steamship, a slow and unpleasant way to travel, believe you me. On the SS Perugia, that's the picture of the boat in this particular in the next slide. And Vincenzo and Victoria brought along two additional people. Victoria's younger sister, Rosie, and her even younger brother, Giovanni, who, as soon as he got to the U.S., started using the name John. So Vincenzo Cento came back to the U.S. and landed in New York in June 1903, along with his new bride's sister and brother. Now, this is consequential for us in Quincy because Rosa would marry another Italian immigrant, and Rosa, who would soon be nicknamed Rosie, and Victoria would leave the rest of their lives in Quincy, Illinois, meaning the two great aunts of Pope Leo XIV are buried in St. Peter's Cemetery. And they were so poor when they died, they don't have grave markers. These were hard-working first-generation immigrants, and they did not prosper financially. Along for the ride as well was young John Rigatano, and we're going to condense a lot of his life as quickly as we can. This guy moved at light speed when we look at his life. First of all, he's already 26 when he gets to the United States. He is said by all to be bright, funny, handsome, well-educated. Now, why is he well-educated, given that he's from a relatively lower middle-class family of limited means in Italy? Well, he claims that he studied for the priesthood, according to one report, and that might be one reason a 26-year-old Italian with an education might not be married at 26. He claims in a secondhand report that he ultimately didn't want to take the vows for priesthood. But here he is, and he almost immediately enrolls at St. Francis Solano College. He gets to Quincy in, I believe, March of 1984. By September, he's a student. He would continue at St. Francis Solano College in both the fall and spring terms, in 1904, 1905, 1905, 1906, fall of 1906, and it appears that he registered for classes initially in 1907, but the grade record we have from that time is blank, which probably means he didn't finish classes and may not even have started them. But for at least 2.5 years, he was here as a QU student, and we'll talk about his classes in more detail in a few minutes. He was reportedly, after he stopped teaching taking classes at St. Francis Solano College, engaged for a time in 1908, but his fiancee died unexpectedly. He would then go on to teach Romance languages, which are again Italian, French, Spanish, while he was at QU, let's just say QU for convenience, let alone after he leaves QU. He would teach in the region, in places in Iowa and in other places, like Galesburg, Illinois, where my family's from. And he would probably begin his Chicago teaching career in 1910, when he first ran an ad to be a teacher. While other people might have built a small business like a grocery store or a corner store or a fruit stand, Giovanni Rigatano, sometimes Salvatore Rigatano, depending on which name he used, had his own small business. He taught languages for a living. He went to different places, he opened classes, he advertised aggressively. That's how he made his living for his entire life. Eventually, his sisters would pass away in Quincy, at first in 1949 and then in 1958. And he would remain in the Chicago area until he died in 1960. So it was first Quincy for a good long while, then a few other places briefly, then finally Chicago for decades. While he was still at QU, he taught at Quincy High School. Anybody a QHS graduate? Okay, got a couple of you. This is not the QHS you went to. This is the one, not even the one that's the junior high today. That one was built in 1933. This is the high school before that one. And picture was taken about 1905 which was the same fall that John Rigatano was hired as the Spanish teacher. And they had just added on to it, so it was a very modern, cool building for 1905. By the time he got to Chicago, John Rigatano was pretty fancy. This was the last building where he had his classrooms and offices. This was the Kimball Building downtown. He taught on the 9th floor, and this building is today part of the law school of DePaul University, which is a nice connection because both of Pope Leo's parents went to DePaul. Now, thus far, you've only seen one picture, the profile of Rigatano, which was taken about 1910, and that particular photo was actually a grainy newspaper photo, and somebody cleaned it up using ChatGPT to make it look pretty. That's one of only 3 pictures I'm aware of in the world of John Rigatano. These are the other 2, both really bad newspaper images. The one on the left shows him as a younger man, taken in about 1908, not long after he left QU. The one on the right is taken in 1930, when he was a guy sort of in his mid-50s. Now, it will make Ms. Witt cringe, but through the magic of ChatGPT, I shoved all these photos in and asked for composite photos, first showing John Rigatano in his early 30s, and the second one showing him as a guy in his mid to late 50s. And that's what we get. Thank you, ChatGPT. I think the one in his 50s is probably the more accurate based on the facial structures. But at this point, John Rigatano might have been about my age, so I'll leave you to decide who aged better. Always good to know what these folks looked like. What would it have been like going to QU, St. Francis Solanus College, in 1904? Anybody look at old pictures of this place before? Some of you, but not most of you. We tend to take college as it comes to us. We say, oh, that building's really old. Yeah, some of our buildings are really old. First of all, Friars Field. How many of you have walked across that or had a practice on that? Friars Field was there. I mean, there was some stuff there that isn't there now. But these were fields that were used by the students of that period. They were mostly pretty beaten up because they played sports on them and used them a lot more than we do today. We try hard to keep them pretty. But that was a time when half those fields were sometimes bare. But they were there. Francis Hall, by 1904, was almost exactly as you see it today. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. There were St. Francis Solanus Church right across the street on 18th Street was almost exactly as you see it today. So in a lot of ways, this looked like your Quincy University. It had a largely Franciscan faculty. I think in fall of 2004, there were 20 faculty, counting the music faculty. Of those 20, 14 were Franciscan friars wearing their brown robes. We don't have quite as many brown robes around here today as we did then, but very Franciscan. The student body was quite small. There at Quincy University, between our undergraduate and graduate students today, almost 1,200 students. At this time, there were somewhere between 195 and 225 students each year that he was here. So quite small, and the students were, well, significantly different than they are today because Quincy University ran on what was then considered a German gymnasium model. So the student body was essentially high school and college. So those 200 students, give or take, were as likely to be 14 as they were to be 20. Much bigger age spread. Now, the students were from many of the same places they were today. From the Quincy area, from Springfield, from St. Louis and other cities in Missouri. There were a few from Iowa. There were some from Nebraska. It was basically a Midwestern and Great Plains institution. And, by the way, at that time, Quincy University was all male. The university didn't have its first female student until the 1920s. There were commuter students who lived in town. There were residential students who lived in dorms. And let me tell you, the dorm rooms make how many of you live on campus? Most of you? Your rooms are palaces compared to what those kids were in. The beds were stacked up like this, and there were dozens of beds in each hall. Same room. It was like going to camp all the time. So enjoy your luxurious accommodations, QU students. The picture you see here shows friars and students in fall of 1909. And it would have looked about the same then as it did a few years earlier. This is a picture most of you have never seen before. And go ahead and squint. This is a picture from 1896. In the forefront to the left, you can see St. Francis Solanus Church and its tall spire, pretty much looking exactly then, when it was about 10 years old, as it does today. The church where many of you started your college careers at inaugural. If you look to the right, you see the westernmost wing of Francis Hall, where my office is, and where many of you have taken classes. Then you don't see the tower in the middle because the tower hadn't been built yet. It was still a couple of years away. There was a little building between the two wings, but the center section of Francis Hall was built last. And you can see the east wing further to the right, which was built in the 1870s. That's the one part of Francis Hall that had already been constructed when Father Augustus Tolton was at Quincy University. Then again, St. Francis Solanus College. And then you can see a bunch of white frame buildings in front of it. Now, none of those buildings are here anymore. They're long gone, though some of the buildings that replaced those are still here. And this is a picture of Quincy University's Francis Hall, probably about the year 1903. the year before John Rigatano arrived. What's different about the tower? Can you see? It's taller. It's got a church-like spire. When they built the center of Francis Hall, the tower looked different. It was taller because they put a spire on it. But the German Franciscan friar who designed the building was not the best architect ever. And by about 1912, they removed the spire because they were concerned that the tower would collapse. By the way, a couple of years ago, I authorized spending about $100,000 to do further structural reinforcements on the tower. Because even now, we were worried that it was not as strong as it should be. Don't worry, the tower's safe. You're good. What we call College Avenue today was named Vine Street until 1954. And it was a true street with, vehicles until well into the 20th century. And before that, wagons and horses. So what you can see is the same kind of limestone wall that's all over QU ran in front, all the way in front of what we would now call Francis Hall at that time. And you can see there were trees planted all the way up and down in this late fall picture after all the leaves had dropped. So in many ways, this was your Quincy University that was attended by John Rigatano when he arrived in 1904. Well, what did he study? There were about 34 courses of study available to students at QU then, and he studied 9 of them. He studied theology. Big surprise, right? He was at a Catholic school. You had to take theology. He took a physics class, his only science or math course, interestingly enough. Maybe he talked his way out of them because he'd taken a lot of them in Italy. We don't know. He took world and church history courses. He took vocal and instrumental music. We're not sure why. It's not how he made his living. Maybe it was just fun. Maybe he thought he'd teach it. And in fact, he did teach briefly at the Quincy Conservatory of Music. I had no idea there was a Quincy Conservatory of Music, but go figure. And he took English and French classes his whole time he was here. Why would that be useful to John Rigatano? He was an Italian immigrant. He probably needed all the help he could get with his English. And he got great marks in it, but he took French his whole time here. Don't think he was ready to teach French when he arrived in the United States. He learned it later. Now that's important for a couple of reasons. One, he made a living teaching it later, and the other was, well, a French woman who came into his life. More on that later. And for our business faculty, let me assure you that John Rigatano took a robust number of courses in what was then called commerce, in the commercial division. So the Pope's grandfather came to QU, and he took courses in bookkeeping, in typewriting, and and phonography. And your homework is to look up phonography. Not now, later. Not exactly a subject we'll be teaching today. Phonography, P-H-O-N-O, graphy, G-R-A-P-H-Y. Now, grades then were a little different than they are now. That's a grade ledger from 1905, and we have the grade ledgers for every semester, every term that John Rigatano was here. Have you ever heard that you don't want anything on your permanent record that's negative? This guy died in 1960, and I can still look at every one of his grades and give them to you. So think about what might happen to your grades in 75 years or more. Grades were a little different. You got 3 grades in each class. You got a grade for attendance, so we could permanently tell if you failed to show up to class. You got a grade for lack of a better term, for your attitude. You got a grade for, did you pay attention? Were you diligent? And then you got a grade for your subject matter expertise. Did you learn the subject? So the grades we give you today tend to be grades that are focused on just, did you learn the stuff? A, B, C, D. In this case, it was a numerical grade on a 100-point scale, and you got separate grades for attendance your attitude, and whether you knew your stuff. And so those are all listed in these columns in this ledger. Special thanks to Lindsay Witt, who went through all those grade records and a lot of others too, so you could see what they looked like. That's the permanent record, friends. And just his grades in subject matter expertise, did he know his stuff? Here's a sample from his last full semester at QU. In his Christian doctrine class, you got 2 grades, one for midterm, one for finals. He got an 80 and an 80. He barely got a B. What did he allegedly study before he came here? To be a priest. He could barely manage a B. Those friars were tough graders. English, he got an 85 and a 90. Good. All right. French was even better, but hey, it's cheating, right? Italian, he already knew Italian and Spanish. He had 2 Romance languages already. Learning French would be relatively easy after you had those 2. And he took phonography, that mysterious class. It's still your homework. And he took typing. How many of you took typing in high school? Excuse me, keyboarding. Because it wasn't typing by the time you took it. Well, you took it on a computer keyboard. You see that? That's a picture of a 1900 Remington mechanical typewriter where you had to push the buttons to make the ink go through the paper. That sound like fun? Oh, you could do it. You could modern touch type on it, but you were going to be pushing those letters and numbers. Yep, pretty brutal stuff. Now, we learned a couple of interesting things when we went through the Pope's grandfather's records. One is there's a mysterious set of lists. We still don't fully understand them. This one was, I said non-trads. Anyone heard the term non-traditional student? So yeah, if you're a college student trying to earn a bachelor's degree and you're 25 or 30 or 35, you didn't go straight through, sometimes you could get called a non-traditional student. Well, there's a list of 18 students in this particular semester, fall 1904, and the list had partial names for some students, full names for others, and it was labeled at the top, philosophers and roamers. I swear, I'm not making this up. Philosophers and roamers. We're not quite sure what got you on this list. We're not sure if it was a compliment or not. My best guess, and we'll take more research to see if we can confirm that, is that these were people who were here who were a little outside the norm. They were a little older. They were part-time students. They maybe didn't want to be in one of the standard programs of study. Certainly that was true for John Rigatano, who was not in a standard course of study at QU. And so this list is there. It seems like an internal set of notes for the Franciscan friars. Wasn't an official record. There's another list of the roamers for another year. But it's a mystery. And there's one other mystery that's really interesting. The people in this room are by and large getting some scholarships if they're at QU, right? And I hope you appreciate those. They're a big deal. John Rigatano had his own scholarship story. We know that his family was not wealthy in Italy. We know he was hustling for work, even while he was a student at QU. But when Lindsay found the bookkeeping records, what did they all say?
That everyone else had tuition, or people would say check received for so-and-so, payment for so-and-so. There was a money record for pretty much everyone except
John Rigatano. If you didn't hear that, what Ms. Witt said is that for every other student, there was a dollar figure that was supposed to be paid, and then there was some note that it was paid, and usually by whom. There's a little variance, but the one that was truly mysterious was John Rigatano, because all of his records said donated. And we have no idea by whom. Now, it would make sense to say, well, he had Italian family in town. He had a sponsor, his older sister's New husband, maybe he paid. Well, maybe, but most of the time if your family paid, the family name was written in. So we don't know why it wouldn't have been written in here. Could it have been donated by other Italian families in the area who took a shine to this guy? Could it have been from some nonprofit? We just don't know. But for some reason, John Rigatano was a full scholarship student. And I think you've run out of records to go through, right, Lindsay? So we may never know this one. But he was a pretty bright guy, even though he's only earning 80s in Christian doctrine. And that's the first part of this story. That's the QU story. You've seen records no one in the world has seen before, and believe me, they want to. Because there's a lot of interest in the family of the first American Pope. So glad you got the chance to be here first to see those records. And they will become public in 2026 as part of the Rigatano Prevost file. So if you want to do research in this area, you'll be able to go to the special collections at Quincy University and see the records up close and personal. So, and we thank Dean Kraschauer and Ms. Witt for being the folks who make this possible, because this is a big and important new addition to QU's library. But you know, that's the part of the story that's unique to QU. But there's another Quincy story, which is the story that everyone wants to talk about when they want to talk about John Rigatano or Giovanni Rigatano or John Provost. And that's the story of how did an Italian guy named Giovanni come to die and live long before that with the French name Prevost, which was not his family name. Pretty unusual to have a different last name than your grandfather did. But that's exactly what happened in the case of the Pope. Whether he knew that or not is a different question. So, if you'll indulge me for a little while longer, this is the part where we get mystery and a different version of the Catholic lesson, and maybe some love and sex and betrayal thrown in. Ready for love, sex, and betrayal? Sure. A couple of notes. First one is that when you have an incomplete record, you have a lot of stuff you know and a lot of stuff you don't. It's very hard to put the mystery together. How many of you watch the mystery show, you try to put all the clues together, and it madly and ornately comes together in like 30 minutes or 60 minutes or 2 hours first of the movie? It's not going to be that neat and tidy here. The clues are incomplete. The second is we need to be very careful about speculation. There's a difference between what we know and what we guess. Anyone ever heard this before? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Do you hear that? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because you don't have a piece of paper that you like to have doesn't mean the paper doesn't exist someplace with some important information on it. Does that make sense? So we're going to show you a mystery to which there's no definitive answer, at least not yet. We might have a more definitive answer in 5 years, and 10 years, and 15 years when talented professional historians like Dr. Rohan go digging through the evidence for a very long time. But until then, we're going to be left with some mysteries. So let's be careful about speculation and remember the difference between what we know and what we guess. So, what do we know about the family life of, let's still keep calling him John Rigatano because he used John much of his life. He only used his Italian version of his first name when it was convenient for him. Well, first of all, we know that after he moved to Chicago, he married a woman named Daisy Hughes. Daisy Hughes was a year older than he was. They were already 37 and 38, very old for first marriages in the United States at this time. We're not quite sure about Daisy's history. We need a lot more research on her. She later claimed that she'd been living in Chicago since 1910. She later had a sister who was living in the Chicago area, so not sure when or how she came over or why. But they were married. And while some early people online guessed that John Rigatano met Daisy Hughes when he was working in Iowa, it's equally plausible that he met her in Chicago. And then things get weird. John Rigatano was as Catholic as they came, may have studied for the priesthood. When he was back in Quincy, he was a godfather at St. Peter's Church for his nephew who had been born to his sister. There's no reason to believe he was not a reasonably observant Catholic. He got married to Daisy Hughes at Emmanuel Baptist Church on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. That Reverend Johnson Myers, who married them, was a sort of famous conservative Baptist preacher. Now, okay, people get married of different religious faiths these days with a great frequency. I mean, my parents did. But it was rarer then. It was sometimes frowned upon in many circles. And at that era, there was just a weirdness to this. Why would a reasonably observant Catholic do this very non-Catholic thing? We'll say more about that later. But, okay, they got married. We got the marriage license. We know it happened. There's no evidence they had children. And the evidence is very compelling that they had permanently separated by 1927. I mean, by that time, Daisy said that she didn't even know where he lived, which, by the way, wasn't true. But by 1927, they were definitely Splitsville. How did we get there, though? That takes us to a really now famous article published in a Quincy newspaper about something that happened in Quincy on Main Street, a few minutes drive or walk from where we are now. This story was published in March of 1917. It was published in the Quincy Daily Herald. The title that you can see is Rigatano and Triangle. What kind of triangle? Love triangle. And I'm not trying to be flippant about a serious subject, but it's late, so cut me some slack. Now, this story is a continuation of a story that had just run in a previous edition, and a story that was told in multiple newspapers in Quincy, a town that had multiple newspapers at the time because it was a thriving small city. And it told this story, that back in Chicago, John Rigatano's wife, named Daisy, remember the last name? Hughes, had sworn out an arrest warrant to arrest her husband, John Rigatano. What did she want him arrested for? Adultery. Cheating on her with another woman. Now, is adultery a crime in 1917 in Illinois? Yes, it's a misdemeanor. It is illegal, punishable by jail time and a fine, to sleep with someone you're not married to when you're married. By the way, is adultery a crime in Illinois today? Yes, it is illegal in Illinois to sleep with someone you're not married to when you are married. It's a Class A misdemeanor, punishable, in theory, by jail time and a fine. The police do not prioritize prosecuting this misdemeanor. But it is, Illinois then and now, it's a crime. Furthermore, she swears out an arrest warrant not only against her husband, who is arrested in Chicago, she swears out an arrest warrant for a woman named Suzanne Fontaine. Remember those list of names I gave you? Here's Fontaine. Suzanne Fontaine is not in Chicago. They can't find her. But they find evidence that she had her steamer trunk, it's 1917, shipped to an address on Main Street in Quincy. And the police in Quincy find Suzanne Fontaine living in the home of Vincenzo Cento and his wife Victoria, who just happens to be John Rigatano's sister. You're following, good. So this woman who John Rigatano has allegedly had an adulterous relationship with is now in Quincy staying with John Rigatano's sister. Following? She's arrested and shipped back to Chicago, where theoretically there will be a bond hearing and maybe criminal proceedings. How many of you have heard this story? Not many of you, so this is the first time for many of you. Now, Vincent Senzo insists that this is not what it appears to be. That in fact, Ms. Fontaine is a young woman of high repute, that he knew her father well back in Italy, or someplace, that he had met her when she was a little girl, that her family, moreover, knew the Rigatano family, and that when she'd come to Chicago, knowing no one, but knowing that John Rigatano was supposedly there, that she went and found him, they had a nice chat. He suggested that the Cento family was down in Quincy. She said, "A name I know," and came down to visit. That it was all innocent, and that what she was not trying to do was hide from the cops. Now, there are some quite notable holes in Vincent Cento's story. For example, Vincent Cento left Europe in 1891. Suzanne Fontaine was born in 1894. So he didn't know her when she was a small child, unless she came to the US, which did not happen. Secondly, Vincent Cento was from southern Italy. The Fontaine family was from northwest France. That's several hundred miles. So pretty suspicious. And he talks about her amazing family. They'd gone off to, that her brother and her brothers and her father had gone off to war together. Now, she had two brothers, and they probably did serve in World War I. But there's some evidence her father had abandoned the family about 1906. So the brother and the father's going off might have happened, but that doesn't quite line up with the evidence of family abandonment several years earlier. So lots of holes in Vincent Cento's story. So there are two possibilities in this story. One is that Vincent Cento made it all up trying to cover for his brother-in-law and for this young woman who's been staying with him for a few days. She is, I say young woman, she is 18 years younger than John Rigatano. Age gaps are then a thing, as they are today. The second possibility is that he's a guy speaking a second language, speaking to a journalist at a time when journalists were not always real good with the facts, that the story got garbled, but there's still elements of truth to it. We'll come back to that in a second. But right now, the story does have holes. They are obvious. So this is the famous story. It's easy to find online. Read it yourself. What happens next? Well, Vincent Senzo tells the paper later in a story that's published at the end of March. Keep reading and you'll see it gets really interesting. But tells the paper that, hey, they went off, they got bail, sort of. And by the way, John Rigatano is no longer living with Daisy Hughes, his wife. So he tells the papers that he keeps saying that they're going to be proven innocent. There is no evidence that there was a trial or a conviction on the adultery charges. And remember then as now, how interested are the cops really in investigating adultery if one person says it happened and the other says it didn't? Unless there's actual proof from an objective third witness, it's he said, she said, and no one, and since it's consenting if it happened at all, the cops just aren't interested, as they probably wouldn't be today. Everybody understand that? So there's no evidence of a trial or a conviction. Suzanne Fontaine travels. She travels to Detroit. She travels to Toronto. She comes back to the United States. All got records of her coming in and out of the country. She seems to have worked as a governess for a time. Then, in July of 1917, in of all places, Lackawanna, New York, south of Buffalo, for any of you who know your New York geography, she gives birth to a son, John Prevost, who becomes, at that moment, which no one knows at the time, of course, the Pope's uncle. John Prevost, born in 1917. This means at the very time that Suzanne Fontaine was in Quincy being questioned by the police, she was 4 or 5 months pregnant. I mean, the actual descriptions of her say she's 5'3" and 118 at one point in her life, so she's a pretty small woman. It's hard to believe that it would have been noticeable that she was 4 or 5 months pregnant. But there's no mention of her pregnancy by any of the journalists who would have loved to talk about it. So apparently they were able to hide that fact. Now, why would she go to Lackawanna? That's a great mystery. There are a couple of different explanations. On the birth certificate, she lists the name Jean Prevost. Now, Jean is French for, in English, John. Of course, John in English is Italian. It was the English for the Italian. And of course, we've met John Rigatano. But she uses the last name Prevost, which is, by the way, her mother's birth name. Her mother is a French woman named Jean Prevost, who's back working in the northwest of France. Suzanne lists Jean Prevost as a French person, and an instructor is his alleged work. That does line up with teaching languages. But John Rigatano is definitely not French. And the father is listed as 30, which is way off. Not even close to the age of the much older John Rigatano. Then we have no evidence of where Suzanne Fontaine is at all until 3 years later. July is her month, apparently. She gives birth to Louis Prevost, the Pope's father, in Chicago. The father is again listed as Jean Prevost, now listed with a different occupation, salesman. He's listed as 42, which again is not John Rigatano's age. You notice, by the way, that the father aged 12 years and 3. Again, people were real bad with forms back then, lots of errors in paperwork. Again, Suzanne Fontaine might not have had much of an incentive to be wholly truthful. Let's stop here and talk about that. Why would Suzanne Fontaine be less than wholly truthful about when she gives birth? She's not married. And in that era, it would have been commonplace for a single woman giving birth to lie and say she was married. It's hard to check. They don't have the internet. And even today, how do you know people are married when they say they are? Yeah, you check out the rings. Other than that, you basically take their word for it, right? So she said she was married. Now, when she gave birth in Lackawanna, New York in 1917, she did give birth at a facility that was designed for unmarried women. So, real stretch to even list the father or the husband. And again, lots of social sanction for having had sex outside of marriage. So she had every incentive to give a name of a father, even if it was not the truthful name of the father. She used her mother's name, and one of the most common names in French or English. So, let's try to smash together what we know so far about John Rigatano, Daisy Hughes, and Suzanne Fontaine. Exactly right. And we're getting close to the payoff on this story. We remember that Rigatano and Hughes marry in 1914. What do we know about Suzanne Fontaine? Remember the La Touraine, the French passenger vessel I showed you? She was on that boat. She arrived in the U.S. in 1915, in March. She was in New York until at least June 1915, staying at a home for friendless French girls. I swear that was the title. Which is another way of saying French women who came to the country without any family and who would, in some cases, go directly there to stay because it was run by an order of nuns and it was designed who were French and who wanted to take care of single French women so they did not come to a bad end. Again, she stays there until at least June 1915. We don't know anything else about what happens until we know, because we can do math, that she's pregnant sometime around November 1916. She has definitely met John Rigatano by 1917. In fact, John Rigatano's, he's already teaching in Chicago at the Fine Arts Building downtown, very nice place. Daisy Hughes seeks his arrest and Fontaine's arrest in 1917, at which point we're told that Hughes and Rigatano have separated. Then it gets weird, because you look and listen to that and say, oh, okay, there's a kid, there's a fight, maybe they're going to permanently split up. Well, in late 1918, John Rigatano has to file his paperwork for the World War I draft. We know it can't be before September of 1918, even for this undated draft card, because that's when the law was changed that somebody as old as he was would be part of the draft. And he claims that he lives with his wife on Greenleaf Avenue, his wife Daisy. Now remember, this is over a year after, back in New York, Suzanne Fontaine's given birth to a son. In 1920, the U.S. Census lists John Rigatano and Daisy Rigatano living, again, at the Greenleaf Avenue address in Chicago. In 1925, John Rigatano files paperwork to become a U.S. citizen, something he never actually does, listing Daisy Rigatano as his wife. So we have paperwork from 1918, 1920, and 1925 saying that John Rigatano is married to Daisy Hughes and apparently living at the same address. I keep saying apparently. Now, 2 years after that last 1925 paperwork, in 1927, Daisy Hughes files a form of her own in which she lists in a government form John Rigatano as living at an unknown address, suggesting they are no longer together. Now, it is crazy town to say, that's a technical term, that Daisy Hughes does not know where John Rigatano lives, or at least where he works, because John Rigatano advertises where he works, with a street address on the advertising. He works either at the Fine Arts Building or after 1934, if not earlier, the Kimball Building, the picture you saw earlier. She knows where he is. He's a well-known person in Chicago. He's a prominent teacher of languages. He's listed in books as a well-known teacher of languages. He is on a radio program in 1930. He testifies in front of the Illinois House or does a reading there or something in Springfield. This is a guy people know how to find, even in the pre-internet age. But she says he lives at an unknown address. And there's no evidence that Daisy Hughes and John Rigatano ever see each other again. In fact, in 1939, Daisy Hughes dies. And her sister fills out her death, is the informant for her death certificate. By the way, when you're the person who gives the state the information on somebody who died, you're the informant. Well, her sister, Edna, that was a name, is the informant, says that Daisy was married to someone named Joe Rigatano, misspelled, and the Joe Rigatano is dead. So I don't think Edna knew much. And in 1940, John Rigatano files a piece of paperwork that says his name is, that he came into the country as Salvatore Giovanni Rigatano, but that his name today, the name he uses, is John Rigatano Prevost. And Suzanne claims, as she has for years, going back to the 1920s, that her name is Suzanne Prevost, Mrs. Suzanne Prevost. And they both list the same Ellis Avenue address in Chicago. So that's the mashup. Fontaine is accused of having a relationship with Rigatano in 1917. She has children with a mysterious John Prevost listed as the father in 1917 and 1920. She keeps using the name Prevost for herself, but nobody emerges who calls himself John Prevost until, for the paperwork we have, at least 1934, and not definitively until 1940 when it's John Rigatano Prevost. Got it? That's a lot of mystery. Now, let's be honest, some families have secrets, right? I'll confess, nobody in my family would talk about my paternal grandmother. She was a complete mystery to me. I didn't learn much of anything about her until I took a DNA test on Ancestry.com. Then my long-lost cousins contacted me and told me all about her. There were mysteries for a reason. It got even more interesting because in the course of uncovering that set of mysteries, I also learned that the woman my father thought was his grandmother wasn't. He'd been lied to his whole life. Families sometimes have secrets. Some families outright lie. And so we're left with a lot of forms that have wrong information. We're left with some stories that seem incredible. And we have to sort out what's true and what's not when the evidence is radically incomplete. Good luck with that right now. And so, there are two possible hypotheses that I know of with variations on the themes for what happened back then. The first one is the one you will find everywhere on the internet, including on Wikipedia. And we'll call that the parallel relationships hypothesis. Isn't that a polite term? Parallel relationships? How many of you would be okay if your romantic partner was in a parallel relationship with someone else? I'm getting a no from you. But that's the parallel relationships hypothesis. In this one, the conclusions are, first of all, that John Rigatano was indeed the biological father of both Prevost children in both 1917 and 1920, that he met Suzanne Fontaine somehow in Chicago by chance, that there was no prior family connection, that there was no Italian-French sort of prior knowledge. They met, they became romantically entangled, that Vincenzo Cento was lying when he said there'd ever been anything else to explain their meeting. That John Rigatano maintained some semblance of a marriage to Daisy Hughes for many years, while simultaneously keeping track of Suzanne Fontaine and perhaps still romantically involved with her, and perhaps in the lives of his two young children. That finally, after years of maintaining two households, he must have left Daisy Rigatano between 1925 and 1927, and that John Rigatano claimed ultimately to be married to to Suzanne Fontaine, especially after Daisy Hughes died. Got it? Now, obviously easier to claim to be married to someone else after your first wife dies. And there's some other complexity to that too. But that's one version of the story. Let me make this complicated. There's another hypothesis. We'll call it the second marriage hypothesis. It is possible, because there are big holes in the life of Suzanne Fontaine's dad, Ernest Fontaine, who was a pastry chef, not a wealthy man, but pastry chefs, any kind of chef, is pretty mobile. There was economic trade between Sicily and the northwest of France. It is possible that at some point, or at multiple points, Ernest Fontaine did make his way to Sicily, that there were family connections, and that while Vincent Cento's story is objectively wrong on multiple facts, it is still possible that Ernest Fontaine had a relationship, even a close friendship, with members of the Cento and the Rigatano families. And that could explain why Suzanne Fontaine might have sought out members of those families if she knew they were in America. Furthermore, Suzanne's location at times in her youth are unknown to us. In the 1912 French census, for example, her mother is no longer living with her father, but Jean Fontaine is living with her 2 sons, but not Suzanne, who's absent from the household in 1912. No, sorry, 1906, when she was a child. Could she have been traveling with her father? We don't know. We can't prove whether she did or she didn't. We know that Rigatano separates eventually from Daisy Hughes. Whether they were married only on paper or actually living together for years is hard to know. Any of you know families where people are married but not living together and haven't lived together for a while? I do. So we don't know what the relationship was exactly between John Rigatano and Daisy Hughes. I assume her accusing him of infidelity in 1917 wasn't great for the marriage. And in the end, we don't know exactly or to what degree John Rigatano got together with Fontaine, but it is possible that he did so only after he was done with his relationship with Daisy Hughes. It is possible he did not have an affair with Suzanne Fontaine, and it is possible that Suzanne Fontaine had a romantic relationship with someone else before she later connected with John Rigatano. The only definitive way to settle this in the modern era is with DNA test. And I personally am not asking the Pope to take a DNA test to solve this one for us. And again, if John Rigatano was a loving, faithful father figure and later stepfather to the children, does it matter? Shouldn't, didn't to them. This was a family in the end that seemed to be very close, deeply faith-filled. Both of the Rigatano boys, the Prevost boys, whoever their father was, were practicing Catholics and very faith-filled, as far as I understand the testimony about them. The families passed on their religious beliefs, which certainly explains why one Prevost might go on to become a priest and a pope. So whether or not John Rigatano is the biological father is not terribly interesting to me. But we'll finally point out, even the question of who's married to whom is questionable. We said this marriage in 1914 to Daisy Hughes was a little weird. We found the marriage record. We've never found a divorce record for Daisy and John. We've never found a marriage record for Suzanne and John. Does that mean there wasn't a marriage? Here's one of the problems of doing historical work in an archive. Paperwork gets lost, it gets misfiled, it gets burned, it gets stolen. I'm sorry? Not in your archive. Ms. Witt's very, very careful. Yeah, but Ms. Witt cannot say that that didn't happen before she came to QU. Because if it got lost or stolen in 1955, she can't fix that. Yeah, she does not have a time machine to the best of my knowledge and belief, and if she does, I'm not paying her enough. But in all seriousness, divorce records in Illinois were county-level records. There was no central state repository for them. Now, if you got divorced in a county like Cook County, where Chicago is, those records have all been digitized and are searchable, and it's pretty easy to find them. Do you think that's true in Fulton County, Illinois, population 15,000?
No.
There are 102 counties in Illinois. The only way to know if there might be a record still available, is to go to every one of those courthouses or digital records in the counties big enough to have digitized them. And then all you've done is search 102 counties. That doesn't mean that the record hasn't been lost or stolen or burned. And it gets worse. And again, divorce was hard to get, so it would be a little challenging to get one in Illinois without Daisy's cooperation. But if we would know if she didn't cooperate, we can't know without because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It gets still harder. Remember we talked about divorce tourism? I mean, Suzanne and John wouldn't have exactly had a language barrier going to France, but we'd have found that because the entry and exit records are pretty good. But we wouldn't necessarily figure out if they went to Wisconsin or Indiana or Missouri or Iowa, let alone to states that are easier on divorce like Arkansas or Nevada at that time. And again, you don't even know what state to search in. You don't know what county it happened. You don't know. And then let's go to marriage in the Catholic Church. As canon law and guidance existed at that time, there is no way that we can imagine plausibly that the Catholic Church would have recognized that Baptist marriage as sacramentally valid. It would have been civilly appropriate. I mean, it's a lawful civil marriage, but it's not sacramentally valid according to the Roman Catholic Church. And if John and Suzanne had approached a friendly priest at that time with small children, with a desire to sacramentalize a marriage in a way that would presumably have been good for the children, there is some chance that such a sympathetic priest would have created what would have been called at the time, I believe, Father, a marriage of conscience. Not civilly valid, but a marriage within the Catholic Church and recognized by the Church. Got it? So whether it's the first hypothesis or the second hypothesis, it is possible that there is within some parish a set of records showing a Catholic marriage between these two. And again, how many states and dioceses can you choose from? Especially if the priest might have been stretching the rules and might not be eager to file the paperwork. I'm sure that never happens, Father. So what I'm giving you is a sense that there's so much we don't know yet. This is the easy research that's been done so far. Not that it's been easy, but we haven't gone through 102 counties yet either. We may someday, and likely will, know more about the story of John Rigatano, Daisy Hughes, and Suzanne Prevost. But we don't have all the answers quite yet. I mean, and even when we have the documents like this one, that's the 1920 census, the page that has the names of Giovanni or John Rigatano and Daisy Hughes, saying they are husband and wife living together on Greenleaf Avenue in Chicago. Does that mean they were actually living together? Does it mean they were both there to be informants to the census official? All one of them had to do was be there and say it was there. Say it was they were husband and wife living there, even if John Rigatano hadn't lived there for years. The form doesn't tell us everything we want to know. So the mystery is still before us. Both of the hypotheses I presented fit the facts, or at least are not contradicted by the facts. Most of us like a juicy sex story, if we've watched enough movies and television. And so we're tempted to believe the first one's true. Come on. Most of us like those stories. But that doesn't mean they're true. Not in this case. We don't know. And so that's the mystery. What do we know? John Rigatano does not succeed and thrive and go on to teach languages and have a family that he supports and cares for some parts of his life at least, without having come to QU, been successful, learned 2 languages, and gone on to a thriving career. And the story of how there are 2 children named Prevost clearly runs right through Quincy, Illinois as well, with no certainty about who was parent to whom and when, but with an end result of a loving, supportive family that gives rise to several faithful Catholics in multiple generations, including one who goes on to become Pope, the first American Pope. It's a fascinating story. It's not over with, but know that your school is always going to be part of that story. And the town you chose to live in or grew up in, depending on whether you're from Quincy or not, is sure a big part of that story as well. I hope you enjoy knowing a bit more about your institution.